Welcome to a CCC Town Hall. I'm Christopher Keneally, host of CCC's podcast series, Velocity of Content. It's Wednesday, 13 April 2022, and our program is looking at data directions. Proprietary and published data can be the key to open new doors to innovation. But if you're using numbers to find answers, our global data experts say you should ask yourself some questions too. Today, we will hear from a panel of distinguished guests. I want to briefly introduce them to you now. Lars Juhl Jensen at the University of Copenhagen, Jane Reed of UK-based Linguamatics, Jeff Joseph with SIIA in Washington, and Sonia Shaikh of the University of Pennsylvania. Over the next hour, they will offer their data directions forecasts designed to be especially useful for the research and publishing communities. We had considered opening today with an audience poll. Given our subject, data directions, I wanted to ask first if you consider yourself data-driven. And then naturally, I would have asked if the organization you work for uses DDDM, data-driven decision-making. Until, of course, I realized who's going to admit they don't use data? Indeed, a recent New Vantage Partners survey of blue-chip U.S. firms in finance, pharma, and healthcare found 99% of organizations aspire to be data-driven in practice and in their cultures. Undeniably, research-forward organizations everywhere turn to data and use AI-enabled data mining technology to accelerate discovery and decision-making. Yet this data boom also raises critical questions about data reliability and public policy concerns over privacy and equity. So please stay with us over the next hour for insightful presentations and engaging exchanges. Most importantly, we want to hear from you. Please add your voice to this important community open forum from CCC by sharing your reactions and responses. We invite your questions too during a roundtable conversation with the panel and all of you. We'll open the program today with Lars Juhl Jensen. Lars Juhl Jensen is professor at the Novo Nordisk Foundation Center for Protein Research at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. He is a group leader of the Jensen Lab, which develops state-of-the-art tools for data and text mining and makes them freely available to the scientific community. He's also founder, owner, and scientific advisor of Intomics, a leading provider of biological insights from applied data science. Professor Jensen has authored and co-authored more than 200 scientific publications that have seen over 45,000 citations in total. And his YouTube channel features 50 videos on network biology, biomedical text mining, and data visualization. So welcome from Copenhagen, Lars Juhl Jensen. And you have prepared for us today a kind of master tutorial of text mining and knowledge graphs. So please make the case for how data technology is revolutionizing research.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks everyone who's taking part today. So I'm talking about from text to knowledge graph, and the question is, why do we need text mining? And the answer to the first question is really simple. If you take a look at the biomedical literature and just try to make a simple back of the envelope estimate, you arrive at the literature being more than 10 kilometers tall if you were to print it. It's probably also more than 20 kilometers and 30 kilometers, but it doesn't really matter at this point. There's simply too much for us to possibly be able to read it. Consequently, we need to get a computer to help us. We need to get it to help us find papers, which is called information retrieval, find things in papers, which is called named entity recognition, and pull out information, which is information extraction, or also known as relation extraction. And the reason why we want to do this is that we want to create knowledge graphs that capture from the literature the interplay between different genes and diseases, drugs and diseases, which drugs target which targets, and so on. Now, the traditional way that people have gone about this is fairly basic. In information retrieval, people have mostly focused on so-called ad hoc retrieval. That's what you use whenever you do text indexing and just go to a resource like PubMed or Google Scholar, type in some words and do a search. There are also document similarity approaches, which try to just say how similar two documents are based on using simple term vector similarities. In other words, do the documents contain roughly the same words? In named entity recognition, the field has been dominated by dictionary-based approaches. That means that in my case, you would have dictionaries of genes and proteins, dictionary of diseases, and these dictionaries would contain the many different synonyms so that we know the same gene, no matter which name you use to describe it. In addition to that, we need a list of bad names that we want to block. For example, in Drosophila, there's a gene called A, and you can all imagine how bad it would go if we went through the literature and thought we were talking about a gene every time people say A. Finally, relation extraction has been dominated by two approaches. One is statistical co-mentioning approaches, which are very basic but powerful, simply assuming that if people keep mentioning two things together, they probably have something to do with each other. On top of that, you have manually crafted rules, which very carefully target specific patterns in text to pull out relations. Greatly simplifying these approaches, I would say that with sufficient work, you can get high precision, but generally the recall suffers. In the past few years, deep learning has really revolutionized the field of text mining. Specifically, everybody nowadays doing text mining is using transformers, which are pre-trained language models which have been trained on very large unlabeled corpora. That is, you take massive bodies of text, such as entire Wikipedia, the Google Books corpus, and you train a model to learn English. You then pile on top of that the whole biomedical literature, and you teach it biomedical English. We then start from these pre-trained models and tune them for specific tasks. This could be to support named entity recognition, where the model will immediately pick up patterns like context around names. So for example, without even seeing the name, if we're talking about something expression, you know that it's probably a gene or protein, whereas if it says diagnosed with something, it's probably a disease. You can also use these very same models for doing relation extraction, looking for patterns like something binds to something else, or mutations in something causes something. In the latter case, it would obviously be a gene and a disease. However, to make these models and specifically to pre-train them for specific tasks, you need a labeled corpus of text. That is, somebody has to go through the text and manually mark up what you want the computer to do, which, as you can imagine, is hard work. There's also been a second revolution in text mining in parallel, which has been sort of a silent revolution that I call the tool revolution. Text mining has gone over decades from being a pure research field where people study text mining for the sake of learning how to do text mining, to it becoming a practical tool that everybody is using. Now, the thing is, while everyone is using it, many people don't realize that they're using it. And that's because these tools are being used to create knowledge graphs that we rely on every day. One example of that is the string database, which I'm co-developing with people Per Borg's group at EMBL in Heidelberg and Christian von Meering's group at the University of Zurich. It's a database where you can go search for any protein or gene of interest in about 15,000 different organisms and look up which other genes or proteins it's likely working together with. The evidence for these networks come from many different evidence sources. However, many users don't realize that text mining is by far the biggest single source of evidence in string. Also, the string database has about 25,000 users weekly, meaning all of these people are using text mining. Yet, these people tend to trust experiments very much, but be somewhat skeptical of text mining. And the question is, why? Because when we benchmark them, we see that the quality of what we pull out of text automatically is just as good as the data we find in curated databases of experiments. I believe the reason for this is that it's much easier to spot errors in text mining. If my text mining tool pulls out something that is wrong, you can read the text and see that it's wrong. But if you have an experiment where half of the interactions are wrong, that is far from obvious. And for that reason, text mining tends to look worse, even though it isn't. Lastly, I want to touch upon the problem of what I call fact or fiction. And that is, when you do text mining, everybody in the community is focusing on how can we best get a computer to extract exactly what is stated. That's what all the community challenges, all the benchmarks are about. How good are you at pulling out from text what is stated in the text? But when we're building a knowledge graph, the purpose is something else. We want to capture what is true. And as you've probably noticed, the literature is imperfect. It contains many false statements. This can be due to outrageous things like publishing paper mills that are generating basically almost computer-generated text, or certainly fake things, and selling authorships, to much more mundane things like just random statistical findings that cannot be reproduced. In either case, if you run text mining on this, you have to realize that computers are naive, and they're going to take everything at face value, meaning that even the perfect text mining system today, according to benchmarks, would extract every claim ever made by anyone in the literature. So the challenge that I see in the future for using text mining to structure the literature into what we actually know is to get a computer to not just read, but read critically. So with that, I want to acknowledge a lot of people who've done the work. I already mentioned that the String project is a collaboration with Per Borg and Christian von Mering, with key people being Damian and Nadja, who have over the years contributed tremendously to this. And the deep learning text mining is spearheaded in my group by Katerina, who is currently visiting the group of Sampo Pysalo in Turku, Finland. And finally, I want to, of course, thank for funding. So String is funded by Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics. I have funding from the Novo Nordisk Foundation and the European Union. And Per Borg has core funding from EMBL. Thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you indeed, Lars Juhl Jensen there at the University of Copenhagen. A really important presentation. It sets the table for us to begin this discussion and gives me, a non-data scientist, a far better idea of the work involved and the potential that text mining offers to all kinds of research, not just the research in proteins that you are doing, but any sort of research of scientific literature or any kind of literature. And I like the phrase naivete, that you were sort of ascribing to the computers this notion of naivete. It's a real sharp point to make, because we assume so much power to these tools, to our technology, but we need to be reminded of the still kind of crude way they approach things.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think it is a big problem, and my personal guess, it's nearly impossible to benchmark, is that when we use text mining today to extract information from the literature, at least in terms of false positive interactions, we're probably getting at least as many errors from the text simply not being true as we get from the computer getting it wrong.
All right. Well, we'll continue to explore this notion of trust and precision with the rest of our program. We'll be back to you later, Lars Juhl Jensen, but thank you so much. And now I want to bring on our next guest, Jane Reed. Jane is Director of Life Science at Linguamatics, where she is responsible for leading strategic vision for product portfolio and business development in the pharma and biotech market, and she has a focus on discovery and development. Linguamatics is an IQVIA company. IQVIA serves the health information technology and clinical research fields using data technology, advanced analytics, and expertise to help customers drive healthcare forward. Jane Reed holds an MA from Cambridge University and a Ph.D. from Birmingham University. Jane Reed, welcome today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be on this show.
Well, we should tell the audience that you have worked in labs as a postdoc in genetics and genomics, and you've had extensive experience as well in companies that supply data products and data analysis to pharma and biotech. And I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts on why using data for R&D decisions means listening to many different voices.
Thank you very much. So I think, thanks really that the previous speaker really in essence gave a great introduction to what I'm going to be talking about. I can't see my slides, but I'm assuming that they're up there. So I wanted to start off by thinking about this whole idea that I think has just been introduced, that in essence, these innovative technologies around text mining, they really have come of age. And unstructured text is now a critical component of decision-making in the pharma data ecosystem. So taking a step back, that whole, as we've just talked about, in order to get the right information for decision support, you really do need to get the landscape of relevant data. And while there is a huge amount of information in structured sources, there's just so much more information in unstructured data. And you need to be able to find it, information retrieval, you need to be able to extract it, you need to be able to normalize it and integrate it and feed it into your analytics, your knowledge graphs, and so forth, in order to get the understanding of that. So why is it so important now? So if we think about the last 2 years, I mean, COVID has really accelerated the volume of rich data that's available for pharma. Whether you're thinking about the sort of capturing the sort of natural conversational information that's coming from patients, from customers, from healthcare professionals, or whether you're really trying to drill into that huge growth in the relevant scientific and clinical research, you need to be able to find the information and then surface it. And as the previous speaker said, being manually reading, manual search is just not enough. And really, there's much more of an acceptance and actually expectation that using the information you can capture from free text data sources is really coming. So with that exponential data growth, healthcare pharma organizations are finding that manual abstraction to be unsustainable, infeasible to capture the right information. So you end up leaving potential insights untapped, locked away in unstructured documents, whether that's your internal documents, your literature, conference abstracts, clinical trial records, even news and social media. There is just so much richness of information that can really deliver insights for your decision making from bench to bedside. So if you can leverage the capabilities of innovative technologies, deep learning, different ways of doing text mining, natural language processing, to automatically process and normalize data from millions of documents from those disparate sources, that will really close gaps in existing knowledge, surface the important context. So again, Lars gave a really great discussion about not just finding the entities, but looking at the relations, looking at the context between them. So that can really close your gaps, surface the information, support better informed decision making. So in essence, natural language processing, it's a family of computational techniques for extracting and normalizing structured data from those unstructured sources. And now we're seeing it's a critical component for modern data-driven pharmaceutical organizations. So that's going back to Chris's start. Who would say that they're not using data-driven decision-making? Everybody absolutely wants to, but it's trying to make sure that you're really getting the full picture, unlocking the 80% of biomedical data. It's a huge amount of the value of information that's out there is in unstructured text, and you need to unlock it for your use in analysis, in insights generation, in data science workflows. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to really think about the data directions in order to be able to get the full picture. So again, this is thinking about if you're trying to make decisions whether you're thinking about in really early research, whether you're thinking about where to commercialize a drug, whether you're thinking about how to deliver a drug, you really need to listen to a number of different voices. And obviously the information is coming in different ways. So when we're thinking about the voice of the patient, this is often can be found, again, from the pharmaceutical organization point of view. You can find it in social media. You can find it in call center notes. You can find it in interactions and patient surveys. But you want to be able to listen in order to be able to hear their voices. They want to know, for example, what can I expect my care experience to be? If I take a particular drug, what symptoms with my disease might exhibit? What treatments are available? What are my options? Are there dietary restrictions for people with my disease? So being able, as a pharma company, to listen to this information is really valuable. And again, capturing that, let's say, from social media, again, the volume is too huge to do manually if you're going to get that landscape. If we're thinking about the central voice here, the voice of clinician, obviously for healthcare professionals, they want to be able to look across, again, a huge volume of unstructured text, looking for what health inequities, the social determinants of health, how should they select the right treatment for a particular patient or find a clinical trial for a patient, how to reduce hospitalization risk. And then focusing in really, again, going back to what Lars, the first speaker, was talking about, the voice of the science. So here is looking in the huge volume of literature, whether you're thinking about preprints or full text or abstracts, whether you're thinking about what's going on in conferences and congresses, being able to understand, find the right information for targets involved in lung cancer, what companies have particular intellectual property, patenting a technology that you might be interested in. What are the safety risks for your drug or for your competitors' drugs or for a group, a class of drugs? How can I find the best site for clinical trials? Again, the answers to a lot of this information comes from unstructured text, and you want to be able to find the right documents, find the right facts from those documents, surface those facts, integrate them with structured data potentially, and again, get that whole picture, which is what's really critical. So on the next slide, one of the other things that we just need to think about is in essence, not just how the technology, but it's actually that it's a broader level problem with availability and accessibility. Because in essence, if you're going to use data, documents, you want to make sure that you can capture it. And in 2016, the FAIR principles were published. And there's been a huge debate ever since around these different principles about making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Now, that obviously is something that's very familiar to anyone who's working within scientific publishing, scientific literature, with those kind of understandings. But actually, those principles apply to any kind of data if you're going to get real value. So even if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're developing your own reports around safety, around clinical trials or whatever, being able to make your internal data findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable is really valuable. And again, that's where innovative technologies can really help drive those data directions, because going back to, again, the first speaker, going back to that volume of information is just too much to do that manually. And one of the key things that named entity recognition does, that natural language processing can enable, is things like finding the right information, finding the right metadata. So finding consistent metadata, standardizing metadata, digitalizing documents so you can work with those documents in a machine readable way for that effective searching. Being able to surface information from legacy documents. Obviously, again, we're very familiar with searches across all of literature, Medline abstracts, but again, being able to do that not just for literature, but across the enterprise. So just my last slide, I wanted just to throw in this final thought. And this is, again, pulling back to that idea that in order to build up the whole picture to get the right data for your decision making, you need to listen to the different voices, the voice of the patient, the voice of the clinician, the voice of the science. And I picked this quote from one of our customers, actually in the healthcare space, but I think it's a great view on data directions. And in essence, this is obviously talking about natural language processing, but it's that idea of taking on board the right technology, innovative technology, to find the answers we need in order to solve the problems. And obviously, in this case, it's solving the problems for the patients, but it's really being able to think back to how do we find the right information for that decision support, right from bench through to bedside for whatever problem you're working on.
All right, right. Well, Jane Reed with Linguamatics, thank you so much. And it's really interesting. You're talking about the pervasiveness of data and hearing all these different voices. And so we are living in a world of data to any extent. We in our public lives, our private lives, professional lives, and I want to then bring on someone who can take up that point and talk about the intersection of data and public policy. So we'll return to you, Jane Reed, in just a moment. But our next guest is Jeff Joseph. Jeff is president of SIIA, the Software and Information Industry Association. SIIA represents more than 450 companies and associations, reflecting the broad and diverse landscape of digital content providers and users in academic, business-to-business and specialized publishing, educational technology, and financial information, as well as creators of software and platforms and companies specializing in data analytics. Jeff Joseph spent 6 years as vice president of communications with BIO, the world's largest biotechnology trade association, and he was a senior vice president at Ogilvy Public Relations Worldwide, where he helped found the agency's technology practice. Welcome, Jeff Joseph.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here.
Well, we appreciate you joining us from your office there in Washington, and you're going to take us on a kind of world tour of public policy initiatives that impact digital equity, privacy, and transparency. So let's set out on that tour then.
Great, thanks, Chris. Well, let me begin by saying that our members and our association strongly support consumer data privacy protections that protect consumers from real harm, and in part by providing measures and substantive, reasonable measures, and that also enable continued innovation and the responsible use of emerging technologies such as AI and some of the applications that the previous panelists discussed. In fact, we believe that a federal data privacy bill is the #1 solution to close the gap between the use of personal data and data-driven technologies driving innovation in AI and machine learning and other technologies. And in fact, in this time of great divide in our country and here in Washington, this is an issue that cuts across the aisle. Polls show that there's bipartisan support. About 80% of both Republicans and Democrats say that Congress should make a federal data privacy law a top or an important priority. So that sets the stage. And the fact is that that we don't have a comprehensive federal data privacy law, we're ceding the playing field to other nations. As you'll see on this map, that we're but a handful of nations that doesn't have a data privacy regime in place. And in fact, if you look closely, some of those nations that the challenge here or the fear is that by ceding that playing field, we're allowing nations that don't share our democratic values, don't share our desire for free and open internet to sort of set the game and set the global standards. So it's a real danger as in this continued era of connectivity that we lead in setting digital policy globally. On the next slide, you can see that that I'll walk through just a few slides here, but there's a lot of activity going on in Congress. In fact, we currently have data privacy regulations and laws for specific sectors. So for example, HIPAA, which the members of the audience may know, regulates the collection and use of sensitive personal health information. COPPA regulates the use of data on children. The Federal Credit Reporting Act governs the use of data, of credit reports. So we have that sectoral, but we don't have this sort of comprehensive federal legislation. Now, there are a number of measures that have been introduced in Congress. We've highlighted here some that may be of particular interest to this audience. For example, the Stevens bill here, which would oversee, direct the National Science Foundation to support research grants for privacy data enhancing technologies. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can see at the bottom there in the House, there's a number of bills in the House as well. This would amend the Homeland Security Act, establish a program for industry academics and individuals to provide solutions for cybersecurity vulnerabilities, so addressing that area. In the next slide, this goes to the Senate, and two here that may be of interest: the Data Care Act of 2022, which imposes responsibilities on service providers regarding the identifying data, including some security issues, and the Mind Your Own Business Act from Senator Wyden of Oregon, which requires some periodic reporting, opt-out processes, and imposes criminal penalties for false certification of those data reports. On the next slide, again at the bottom, I'll go to the two at the bottom, the Data Protection Act of 2021 from Senator Gillibrand, and the Wicker Bill at the bottom, which begins to set a data privacy regime. Now, when I prepared these slides last week, I highlighted the S1667 there in purple from Senator Klobuchar, because that seemed to be the bill that had the most momentum going forward. But the world moves quickly. So here in Washington this week, there's a core privacy conference going on, and just yesterday, a group of congressional staffers spoke, and they announced that they're making positive momentum on a federal data privacy bill, and indeed are relatively optimistic that we may have a bill that moves forward in Congress even this year. And it's built in part on the Wicker Bill that's noted at the bottom. It is working with Senator Cantwell of Washington, and they're working through a couple of sticking points, but they expressed optimism. There are news reports today that they expressed optimism that we may see movement as soon as this year. So yeah, that's how quickly things are moving. Just a few days ago, I thought it might be the Klobuchar bill, and here we are just a couple of days later talking about something completely different. If we move to the next slide, in the absence of a federal data privacy bill, we've seen a number of states engage on this issue. In fact, since 2018, 37 states have introduced more than 72 bills regarding data privacy. Now, here in this slide, some of those bills died as they were introduced in previous years. When the legislature left for the year, the bills died. But you get a sense of that momentum. And the danger here is that without a federal bill, if we can't actually get something done, we'll have this unworkable patchwork of 50 states with their own laws, which is anti-consumer. If you're moving from Massachusetts to Virginia, where I live, how are you as a consumer, you're going to know how your data is going to be used? How do you track a state-by-state patchwork? And it's anti-innovation. Companies, even large companies, will have a difficult time complying with this patchwork of state laws. In fact, one organization found that patchwork would cost companies over $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, in compliance costs, and cost small and medium-sized businesses over $200 billion in compliance costs. That's just unworkable and untenable. So we need a federal data privacy law. So as we've engaged with Congress, if we move to the next slide, we've identified a series of principles that we think are critical that Congress consider as they're developing a comprehensive federal data privacy bill. The first is that it has to provide for strong federal preemptions. That is, that this should be the law of the land, that the state bills the federal bill should supersede those individual state bills. That we need that clarity, we need that continuity again for consumers and businesses. There should be transparency. Consumers should understand how their data is being used, whether it's being sold, how it's being transferred. We should place reasonable limitations on collecting, using, and the disclosure of personal information. And you can differentiate between personal information and public information, but personal information should provide appropriate mechanisms for consumers to have control. If they want to delete, if they want to download their information, if they want to move it from one platform to another, they should be allowed with reasonable precautions to do that. And again, enable the ability to allow for that. We should ensure security. Obviously, data security is a key issue here. And we should focus on the risk of harm. That is, what is the real harm? So, for example, if my email address is released and shared, and I'm flooded with marketing materials, that may be annoying, but it's not a real harm. Unlike, say, if my financial or health data is shared and sold without my authorization. We need to limit the private right of action. That is the ability of individuals to sue companies and platforms covered under the legislation. We don't want this to be a field day for trial lawyers that then discourages continued innovation, prevents startups or small companies from being able to bring their goods and services to market. So we need to have allow for real action, legal action against real breaches and real issues, but focus on the real harms, potential harms, and make sure that we don't undermine our leadership in innovation as we develop this regime. And then finally, we need to distinguish between information that's publicly available on government websites, business transactions, etc., and that's truly private, because that public information can provide for a lot of public good. For example, many of our members use publicly available information to combat fraud, to do security background checks, to engage in corporate due diligence. So there are positive benefits that come out of the use of that publicly available data. So just as we have distinguished between healthcare data, children's data, financial data, et cetera, we need to make a distinction between public and private information. And then finally, this discussion, we focus on data privacy, and we think of that in one way if we go to the next slide, but really it's much larger than that. As we think about the need to transfer data between nations, for example, between the EU and the US, as some of our viewers may know, that the regime that sort of governed that transfer of data between the EU and the US was validated a few years ago, in large part because the US doesn't have a federal privacy regime. So that impacts billions of dollars, trillions of dollars of business between the EU and the US. As we talk about emerging technologies, that understanding having a regime and a context for data privacy is critical as we look at AI and other emerging technologies. And then you mentioned earlier data equity, digital equity. And as we think about making sure that we provide the benefits of technology to all citizens everywhere, regardless of income, geographic location, ethnicity, that we make sure that we use it responsibly, that we need to have that data privacy regime in place to ensure we provide critical protections for all citizens. So that's where we stand at this point, and I'm looking forward to engaging in conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jeff Joseph, because, we've been hearing from the other presenters just about the tremendous investment that businesses are making in data, in the technologies that allow them to use data. And we're all becoming invested in data. So this notion that we need some policies to govern all of that, to protect people and to ensure, as you say, that innovation is allowed to happen, that can come from government. It's a real positive aspect of government policy. We can ensure that data is being used properly.
That's correct. And allowing for this innovation, so there's amazing uses of data that were referenced by earlier speakers. And I think, Chris, not to belabor the point, but we tend to think of these issues as sort of big company issues. This is about Google, this is about Meta, this is about Amazon. No, every company, every business is now in the business of data, whether I'm a large multinational company or whether I'm Joe's Pizza around the corner. Data helps me understand my customers. It helps me develop new products and services. Data is the vital sort of vein that we need to mine to drive the global economy. So having these rules of the road in place so we understand and provide critical protections while also allowing for that continued innovation and economic development is absolutely critical.
All right. Well, Jeff Joseph with SIIA, thank you so much. We'll come back to you during our roundtable discussion. If the audience does have questions for our panel, please use the chat on LinkedIn Live to let us know what's on your mind. I want to now bring in our final presenter, Sonia Shaikh. Sonia Shaikh is the George Gerbner Postdoctoral Fellow at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Shaikh's research interests include how individuals and teams use AI-enabled and automated technology to make decisions, interact, and perform. She earned her doctorate in communication from the University of Southern California. Dr. Sonia Shaikh, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Christopher. I'm so happy to be here. Today, I'm going to focus on the trust element of on how stakeholders trust data and AI. And I have slides with me. Okay, great. So I think it's important to say that success of any data-driven technology or AI-enabled technologies depends really on the extent to which stakeholders trust them. And in the study of management and organizations, trust is a very important variable, as you all can imagine. But the way we have to understand trust in terms of data and AI, it has to be thought about in terms of different stakeholders that are involved in the process of using and developing data-driven technologies and AI. And today, my talk is going to focus on this trust, this human element, and what affects this trust by looking at these different stakeholders. So the three stakeholders on next slide that I will be focusing on are first the tech developers, and the speakers who Lars and Jane have actually already discussed some of this, people who develop technologies and use big data to make innovation that can help users in different sectors. And then the second one group that I think is important to discuss is the corporations and government agencies which use these technologies that are developed by tech corporations or developers or academics and make decisions. And the third stakeholder group, which is very important, and is the public, that is the people for whom we use this data to make decisions. And so first I'll start with talking about tech developers and what affects their trust in technology. So on the next slide, I think as I think it has been suggested here already, people who develop technology or use big data and AI, they usually have high trust in it. And that's because there is an incentivized pursuit of technology. So you can increase profit, you can decrease costs, you can make the process more efficient. And obviously, as Jane mentioned, that during the time of the pandemic, it's really, the need for such data-driven tools has become particularly important. And this also has been obviously seen by the governments in the EU and the United States, that it's important to fund these projects that these developers have. And so now we have billions of dollars of investments, for example, from the US government to develop these data-driven and AI-enabled tools. So there is high trust in it. The second group is the corporations and government agencies on the next slide, who will be using these tools to make decisions for others. So, for example, I think there is the Allegheny family screening tool. So, for example, government agencies in the Allegheny County have this tool where which uses it's a predictive tool, and it determines if a call that comes in for a child, if it assesses it gives a score to that child and gives a suggestion to the child welfare worker that whether they should take this call and actually go ahead and screen this, or go ahead and do something regarding the case that has been given to them. And then there are recruiters and companies which are using technology to make hiring decisions. This goes from resume sorting to actually seeing recordings of people's facial expressions and their tone, and determine if they're a good candidate for their company. And again, these companies which are using data-driven tools, it's first of all their need. The landscape is changing. We have so much information. It's important to use these data-driven and AI-enabled tools, but they want to trust, but there are serious concerns regarding fairness and ethics of these tools, and how data is used. First of all, the kind of data that is generated and the kind of data that is fed in to make these technologies. And because of these concerns with fairness and ethics, it ties into the public sentiment and the very people for whom these technologies are being used to make decisions for. So on the third slide, we have the publics, which are for whom we use these data-driven tools to make decisions for. So on next slide, in my work, I have identified some reasons which affect public trust for AI and data-driven tools. And right now, the landscape is very murky. We don't really know if public trusts AI and data-driven tools, and that is because of several reasons. So first, I found in my research that perceptions of technology's terminology, like if we say algorithm versus machine learning versus AI, it affects the extent to which people are willing to place their trust in it. And this is interesting because we tend to, as academics and researchers, often conflate terms like algorithms, machine learning, AI. But in the public mind, this affects the extent to which it affects their perceptions of trust. And then another thing is that some researchers have found that decision types really affect if people are willing to take a technology and let them make decisions for them. So, for example, technologies used to make hiring decisions are not as trusted, but technologies which can make low stake decisions, let's say manage a database, for example, are trusted more often, or technologies which are doing, let's say, content moderation of apolitical events are trusted a bit more often. And then there is the person character like level factor, the socioeconomic status of individuals, which really affects the extent to which people trust them. So, for example, in the United States, we find that males and whites and college educated individuals are more likely to trust AI and big data initiatives than women and people who belong to minority groups. And that is for several reasons, and I'm happy to go into details of that. But I think the moral of the story is that yes, we need data, and we are developing new directions and technologies to help organizations, but the trust element has to be studied more comprehensively, and it has to be seen from the lens of various stakeholders that are involved in the design, embedding, and the use of technology.
Well, Dr. Sonia Shaikh, thank you for that. And I think the point about the need to define terms and to understand what we're talking about is really critical. But then you added as well, excuse me, the importance of not making sweeping generalizations. So people who trust data, in the United States, there are very important differences even in the United States, but there are also differences around the world. And I think
Yes.
your research has shown that it matters. In fact, where the tech is produced, because we might be a tech exporter or a tech importer, and that's going to affect trust as well.
Absolutely. Actually, there is an Oxford study on this very problem. And we see that, for example, in East Asia, people have higher trust in AI robots compared to Latin American countries. And that can be broadly, if we have to find a post hoc explanation for this, that could be because one group, East Asian countries, develop and create their own technologies, and it's so embedded in their societies, where Latin American countries are, although they are making a lot of progress, they're still importing a lot of that technology. So, that affects how people perceive those technologies.
Right. There is a lot here to consider,
Mhm.
and I appreciate your presentation, Dr. Shaikh, as well as those of all of our guests. And we're going to bring everybody back onto the screen and now bring as well into the discussion our audience and try to take some questions from LinkedIn Live in the minutes left to us here. Please use the chat on LinkedIn Live. Let us know what your question is, and if it's for a particular panelist, just who it's for. And as you think about what you want to ask, I'm going to start the ball rolling here. And Jeff Joseph, turn to you, because you've been helping us understand the intersection of all of this with public policy and the government and the private sector. And SIIA has urged the Biden administration to consider appointing a federal chief data officer, as well as you've supported efforts to update the National AI Research and Strategic Plan. Not only did I not know there were so many different bills under consideration around this issue, but I was unaware there was even a national research and strategic plan around AI. So tell us briefly about the need to have a federal chief data officer. Why would that be an important choice? And would it help public-private initiatives to give us the kind of trusted databases that we all want?
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. So first of all, there's a 2018 law that required all the federal agencies to appoint a chief data officer. And indeed, the Biden administration last November appointed Denise Ross as sort of a chief data officer through the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for this need. One is the discussion we had as we closed my presentation, that data is such a critical component of today's innovation economy. So we really need a comprehensive, unified federal approach as we think about data from a privacy perspective. I think some of the issues and concerns that the professor just discussed are absolutely critical. So there's that piece, and then there's also the use of data at the federal level. I think the piece of language in calling for the chief data officer in the 2018 law was to responsibly unleash the power of data to benefit all Americans. So this role would work across all agencies to establish best practices, recruit and retain the best minds in data management and data science for the federal government. So we think that's absolutely a critical role. Regarding the AI principles, this is an update to a document that the Office of Science and Technology Policy published. And again, this is an area where the US has fallen behind the EU and the other nations who don't have a comprehensive federal strategy on AI. So we've been pleased to work with the Biden administration to offer our input and our thoughts on what that might look like. Just a couple of highlights, that there should be guidelines for responsible and ethical use, that it should be a risk-based approach focused on real harms, not perceived harms, but real harms. It should be technology neutral. So again, the focus should be on the type of data and how it's used, not on the technology platform. And as I mentioned with data privacy, distinguish between public and private collection, storage, and use of data, and provide guidelines that ensures that we protect those underserved and at-risk communities, that we're not misusing the data, that we're responsibly collecting and have truly representative data as we develop the applications that grow out of AI.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff Joseph with SIIA, and Lars Juhl Jensen. We started with you, and a point you made was that trust is an important question when it comes to text mining, and that there had been at the beginning of the process, as we developed these tools, perhaps some over-promising that went on. Are we reaching a point now where we can really deliver on some of those promises, but are we also left with the legacy that some of that over-promise led to some mistrust?
I think that captures it very accurately, yes. So definitely in the early days, before the tool revolution, before the tools were truly useful, there was a lot of overpromises. And that is obviously still holding us back a bit, that people have mistrust because they've seen bad things in the past.
All right. And Jane Reed, do you have some thoughts on that too? Because the kind of data that you're working with it includes the data that Lars was focused on, the scholarly published data, but you also, as you said, are incorporating these other voices, this unstructured data, the voices of patients particularly. And so there might have been as well some overpromising at the beginning, because there is tremendous potential, but we really kind of have to measure that, and we have to define better what our expectations should be.
I think that's a really good call. And going back to what Jeff Joseph was saying, we are seeing more and more within pharma clients that they are looking for chief data officers, chief data privacy officers. And part of that is there's a much bigger focus in the last few years around patient centricity. I'm sure you've all heard that phrase, looking at health inequalities, looking at social determinants of health. I'm really trying to make sure that as a pharma company, you are engaging with a very broad set of patients. And so obviously you're looking at more patient data, you are looking into social media, you're looking at blogs, you're talking to patient advocacy groups. And again, in order to get the best use for those data, you need to then be able to make sure that you're being very, very aware of any privacy regulations. But the benefits are obviously huge, because if you can therefore, there's crazy statistics. If you look at the proportion of clinical trials that actually match the ethnic background of where that healthcare will be delivered, it's very low, it's very poor. So the wins, where if we can really pull in the information for across those broad patient groups, and therefore be able to utilize that in your clinical development, clinical planning, for example, and therefore across R&D through into delivery of healthcare, then I think that's going to be a big win for the pharma companies.
All right. Well, Dr. Sonia Shaikh, your research around human interaction with data and with the tools that we're talking about using, I think raises the question of whether there's enough discussion about this. Is the public focused enough on the importance of these questions? Do we all need the academics and the creators of these tools, the public policymakers need to be more proactive in helping to educate our customers, our public, about these questions?
Absolutely. I think there is a huge vacuum when it comes to public understanding and perceptions of technology. So, for example, I did a study where I found that giving people different definitions of AI, because there are various definitions out there, and there are two schools of thought, like human aspect and rational aspect. These two, giving different definitions, affected the way they wanted to trust technologies. There is a study out there which shows that if you tell people that Facebook, first of all, a lot of people didn't know when the study was conducted. I think it was maybe 5 years ago that Facebook feeds, your news feeds, are determined by an algorithm. And when you tell people that, their engagement with the platform and the extent to which they perceive it changes. So I think it's really important to educate the public, just like we teach geography and algebra, etc. in schools. We should also teach technology and what that means for us. And I think there is greater engagement required.
Chris, I'm sorry,
There's
if I just follow
I'm
up
sorry,
on
Jeff.
that.
Go
I
ahead.
completely agree. I think there's a lot of discussion in academic circles, and we've heard it here today, but regarding the public, there needs to be more education. And one of the key elements is that for a lot of different reasons, some self-inflicted, some not, there's a focus on the harm, on, when consumers think of the use of data, they think of the negatives. And in fact, there are positive benefits, whether it's in healthcare or if a platform uses my ethnicity to serve me helpful information. For example, I'm an African American. If I get information about the risk of diabetes or sickle cell, that's beneficial. So as we develop these regimes to govern the use of data, we can't just focus on the harms. We have to recognize that there are benefits that come with proper and ethical and responsible use. Those are key words, but there are benefits.
All right. Well, if you do have a question for our panel and you're on LinkedIn Live with us, please let us know what's on your mind. And what's interesting here, Lars, Juhl, Jensen, is we have a question from someone about whether text mining is the next game changer, and that gets back to my earlier point with you that there's been a promise here for quite a long time coming about the potential here, and I wonder whether that sort of signals a kind of impatience that people really are looking for dramatic change. But is what you're seeing as the technology develops a kind of incremental change, incremental improvements, and that we should sort of lower those sort of dramatic expectations?
I think on the technology side, things have really gone fast lately. I mean, ever since people started using deep learning technologies for text mining, things have moved very quick. But where things are going slow, I would say, is more on the possibilities of applying it very broadly. Because right now, one problem is, of course, as I mentioned, the issue of pulling things out of text that are not true because the text is not true. But let's not forget the other half of the problem, which is that most of what we fail to extract from the text is things that we fail to extract from the text because we don't have access to it, or because for legal reasons we're not allowed to text mine it.
Jane Reed, I know that's an important point for you, accessibility, and in particular, being able to make sure you do get not just the traditional information, but all of that other, I'll call it untraditional, but you refer to as unstructured data. It's got to be in there to really inform these decisions properly. Is that right?
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think the elephant in the room really is getting access to scientific literature, scientific research. But I do think that is changing. I think there's much more awareness of being able to get access to text and data mining licenses for that kind of content. So it is changing, but unfortunately, I don't think I think a lot of people are there's a lot of hype about innovative technologies, about AI, ML, and I think a lot of people are hoping that there's some magic bullet. And unfortunately, as Lars was saying, there isn't. The technologies are improving by the day, but it's not a step change, but it is absolutely an evolution. And getting access to the right data, using text mining, and then applying that to the right decision-making models to really help with that human decision-making at the end of the day. Because I think, again, what we haven't really talked very much about it, but a lot of people want to always think about that human in the loop. as opposed to completely automated decision making. And we often talk about augmented AI, augmented intelligence, as opposed to artificial intelligence. So it's always, as Lars saying, you're using your technologies to surface the right information, pull out the information from the unstructured text, but then you still need the human expert to just look at that landscape and say, okay, I can now take I've got the right information to make my decision making, as opposed to enabling the machine to do everything.
Yeah, Sonia, Shaikh, maybe the last word on that human element to all of this. If we also, as part of this education we've been talking about, remind people that this data is not some kind of mythical and sort of objective piece, that we are always going to be needing to include human considerations and make choices that would be made by humans. The decisions ultimately won't be made by the machines, they will be made by people.
Absolutely. And I think there is a lot of misperception where when we frame technologies and data-driven tools, we tend to not really describe it. Sometimes we tend to describe it as if this thing had autonomy and it's making decisions on its own without any human interference. And I think that needs to, when organizations or groups which use technologies, they discuss their technologies in public, they need to be clear as to what this technology is doing and who's really making the decisions at the end of the day.
Right. It's not as if the AI is independent of our human society.
Not
It is
always, yeah.
It is a piece of it.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, the audience on LinkedIn Live and our panelists, Lars, Juhl, Jensen with the University of Copenhagen, Jeff Joseph with SIIA, Jane Reed with Linguamatics, and Dr. Sonia Shaikh with the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. CCC's LinkedIn Live production team today was Haley Sund and Joanna Murphy-Scott. Rob Simon of Burst Marketing is our director. Stay informed on the latest developments in publishing and research by subscribing to CCC's Velocity of Content blog and podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's CCC Town Hall Data Directions. As a Nobel Prize-winning economist once said, if you torture your data, it will tell you anything you want to hear. Take that as a friendly warning and reminder, and treat your data well. It will return the favor. I'm Christopher Keneally for CCC. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye for now.